Okay, now is there search dominance? Actually, I mean, in the United States, almost everybody, not everybody, but about 2/3 of us use Google most of the time, right? And that's considered to be a pretty high market share. The rest of that is controlled mostly by Microsoft and Yahoo, but Yahoo utilizes the Bing search engine really, so it really all goes back to Microsoft. But I went online today, I thought, you know, who's going to have better statistics on Google's dominance worldwide than Google? And this is what I found. All right, so Google's market share worldwide has been hovering around 90% for the last 5 years. My guess is a slight deviation downward in the last few years is because they're barred from being in China. And you know, so that market is growing, and that brings down their share, and it's been stable. Wonder if this is better in terms of just, I'm getting feedback, maybe nobody else is. Okay, I'll pull this towards me. Okay, so the plan for the talk. I'm going to be talking about search dominance. I'm not pretending to explain everything that explains Google's share, but it is something that I've been doing research on for the last, really, some of it started 5 years ago. I don't see Adam Kandub here, but Adam and I started doing work on this a couple of years ago from a different perspective as well. And so, I mean, we're going to look at different factors that might contribute to search dominance, or dominance in search. One of these is work that I suppose I picked up from a psychologist, really. Nod to Bob. Or maybe he doesn't like Kahneman, I don't know. But in Kahneman's book, who did get a Nobel Prize in economics, and one of the early contributors was now really a growing field of behavioral economics. He's talking about the way we have to economize on cognitive resources. Of course, economizing, he didn't use the term, but that's what it means, and I can think of it in those terms as an economist. This is work that Adam and I started a few years ago. I'll talk a bit about something called direct network effects, just because if I don't mention it, it'll be incomplete, but I don't think it's that important here. And then positive feedback effects. This is work that I started doing with 2 former graduate students. Carol Tinger got her PhD here, was the first Quello Center RA, and had her, basically her dissertation funded by the grant that Johannes and I got from the NSF in conjunction with some engineering folks at Rutgers. And Wayne Fu, a former PhD student of mine at Northwestern University, who unfortunately died of a heart attack just a couple of years ago. It's way too early for a really promising career. Once I've talked about things that might contribute to search dominance, then I'll talk about the ways you can leverage search. Once you've got it, how can you leverage that to achieve market prominence in other fields or other types of services on the internet? One is, you know, the strategies that were investigated by both our own FTC, Federal Trade Commission, and now by the European Commission, the antitrust authorities there, arguing that Google has favored its own or its co-owned services in the way that it's structured its search algorithm. So, in the ranking of search results, the unpaid results, their own would come up first. And second is going back to the psychological approach, and this is work that I've been doing with Adam. You can think of them using a strategy to minimize what I'm calling the transport cost, the cost of getting from one website to another, by building in features in their own service that cut those costs down and channel people there and keep them within a circle by making it easy to get back and creating sort of a corral of Google-related services that most people won't get out too much. That's the idea. And then finish by asking how might law and policy respond. So that's the plan. All right. Now, I started thinking about this partly when I read a New York Times summary of an article, actually an article by 2 Israeli psychologists. And it started me thinking about cognitive budget constraints, the fact that you have a certain amount of cognitive energy that can be expended on things like mathematical models and creating charts and graphs and so forth, or in other things that, like mindlessly watching television or playing with a yo-yo, whatever, things that don't require much cognitive energy. And we have limited stores. And they did this study of parole decisions of an Israeli parole court. And people were marching through on a regular basis. And what we have here is, this is the first case that comes in the morning. Parolees come in, they look at their, and it's all being done very quickly. The odds, if you're first in line of having your parole awarded, is about 65%. Second one actually jumps up, and then from then on, it starts to fall. By the time you get to the mid-morning break, you're all the way down to 0. If you're the last guy in the queue at that point, you can go back to jail, right? And then after the break, they've rested, they've also ingested some food, and you've replenished the cognitive supplies. It jumps back up to about 65% again, and then it starts to fall off until you reach this point, which is noon. Your odds there are 10%. They take their lunch break, it goes back up 65%, and then it just falls off a cliff. Right, so you don't want to be in the afternoon if you're not first in the afternoon. Now this tells you something about fate. Right, where you happen to fall in that queue, maybe it's alphabetical. Wildmans are always bad in that regard. But the takeaway from the psychologist side, and Kahneman cites the same study as the illustration, is that we basically have a limited amount of cognitive energy that has to be budgeted amongst the multitude and unlimited number of things that we might want to think about. And for that reason, we then, we, not just we, but all animals have evolved processes by which you economize on how you allocate that precious resource for seriously deep thinking when it might be needed. Right? And so, cognitive processing, of a serious nature, decision making, where you plan and make choices deliberately, it takes a lot of energy. On the other hand, there are things that you do routinely, and you develop habits, and habits take virtually 0 cognitive energy. So we can think about habit formation as a process of developing routines that allow us to preserve energy for other things when they're needed. Now, we don't think about how much we're going to assign to the various categories. This is probably given to us pretty much by circumstances and our sort of evolution-determined responses to these things, but it's there. And so Kahneman referred to this, I paraphrased him, as habit formation is a conversion of frequently repeated sequences of actions or choices to habit, and it creates chunks of behaviors that can be invoked at little cognitive cost. And so what Adam and I were thinking then is that we could apply this to how you navigate the web and how you use the various web services. If you use them a lot, and there's a lot of routines that have to be invoked, they become habitual after a while. And the same thing with trying to find a favorite search service or a favorite service online if you're starting out somewhere else. And so what we're looking at is a process by which slow thinking is replaced by fast thinking as you habituate yourself by repeating an action over and over again. I've broken this down into basically 2 activities. You've got to find a service before you can use it, and I've called that transit, which just means moving from where you happen to be at any given time on the web to the service you want. And the second one is use, which is the sequence of actions you need to go through to make use of the service that you're actually at, that you wanted to use. Both of these, since much can be routinized and therefore you become better at them over time, you use less cognitive energy, rely less on memory. And so we can think of this, or an economist can think of this as an opportunity cost. As you convert these behaviors to routines, to habits, then you've preserved more of your cognitive energy for things that might demand it unexpectedly later on, or even things you might expect to need it later on, like trying to sell your house, something that Susan and I are doing right now. Or what books do I keep before we depart for Boulder? Now, Bob told me he got his shelf down to that much. I'm not quite that efficient. And so, okay, fair warning, economists do models, and I'm going to actually present a fairly simple model. I won't go through all the algebra, but it really is algebra. There's no calculus, nothing complex to work with this. And so just some basic assumptions to begin with. One is that if you repeat an action again and again, then it is converted to habit. This happens over time, right? The habit doesn't form immediately. And if you stop doing it or you have delays between your repetitions, then you start to lose that automaticity. And so the habit, the strength of the habit decays, given the length of those delays. And just assume that both transit skills and the usage skills have their own decay rates. That won't really matter. I'm just pointing out that they're, for what I'm going to say, at least not yet, but that we treat them both separately, and that just assume that we have a web service that is used at intervals of g length of time. Or if you divide 1 over g, it gives you the frequency with which that web service is utilized. And then, given those assumptions, when I've described about habit formation and decay, then the strength of your habit in any given time is a function of the number of times you've done it before, the amount of delay you have, the length of the intervals, where it has to the time it has to decay, and the rate at which decay occurs. Right? And that's all. I mean, everything is really based on those assumptions. That was not the boring part. This is the boring part, and I had to do this. And just some definitions, so you're going to see them in a chart in a moment, as well as the next page. But I've just said let U of n, where n is the number of times you've performed an action, be the usage cost of that action. If there's no decay in your memory, right, in the strength of habit, and that T is the time and cognitive cost of transit to the website of a randomly used service, from a randomly used service, if you've done it n times as well. And then just let K of n just be the sum of those two. So those are your total costs. And if we would then introduce delay, or rather decay, then the lowercase letters are just the same thing, except saying we're just subtracting out the costs associated, or the loss of proficiency associated with decay, the decay of the habit. Right? So this just gives us some useful formulas, which I expect there will be a quiz later. And so you can look at your total cost without any cognitive decay as being a function. You started, obviously no habit when you first use, and then if delta is the rate at which you form the habit, right, to increase in efficiency, then you can subtract delta times the number of times you've used it since. And that's all we're saying. And for lowercase k, right, so it's your actual cost of usage on the nth time. If you do have cognitive decay, it's really the same thing, except we have to add in the fact that so it's subtracted from our gain. We're saying, well, we take away from that the fact that, we're reducing the amount by which we have gained by the fact that you're starting to lose facility with either transit or both transit and with usage. And then there's some maximum efficiency that can be achieved, or in this case, it's a minimum cost of usage in transit. So no matter how many times you do something, it still requires time to do it. It requires these activities, and that's just, if you have no loss of memory, no loss of function, then K-min, capital K-min is as good as you can do. On the other hand, if you do have habit decay, then you're going to be stuck at capital K-min plus the fact that every time you get down there, by the next time you use it again, you've lost some of that and you go back up. And so it's your habit decay function times the size of the interval, and that becomes your stable level of proficiency. Now, these are useful relationships that I think Adam and I will probably use more later on, but it allows us to talk about the cost of switching from one service to another. Economists like to talk about switching costs. If you're using one product, or if you're the customer of one company and you switch to another, do I have to give up something in the process? If I'm a Mac user, I switch to to a Windows machine, then I have to learn a whole new set of routines. That takes time. I have to acquire those. That's a switching cost. There are a lot of different kinds of switching costs. And the fact that you have to reacquire a habit when you switch to a substitute service that it is managed or that operates a little bit differently then becomes a cognitive switching cost. And the notion that you see a lot, at least in the antitrust field, when people are talking about the ease of getting to competition, and Google reads this, is the competition is just one click away. Well, literally that's the case. But when we're talking about the cognitive switching cost, it's not just one click away. It's the opportunity cost of all the things that might be done with that cognitive capacity while you're relearning to get back to where you were with the other service. And so it's a different kind of switching cost, and it has implications for the way that we deal with competition policy for search services, as well as for other internet services. We can represent this graphically, and the upper line just shows that, just our decay function. This is our declining cost function with repetition when you have decay of habit, and it's always above what you have with no decay of habit. I've just shown what it would be like when you've done something 5 times, and if we have to start over, then we're looking at having to do it here. We've incurred that difference from where we were, this difference from where we were, and so on. Those are that sum of those differences is really your switching cost. Now, I mean, my own feeling is this is not trivial. Just sort of, I think most of us can look at behaviors that ideally we should be doing. We don't, just because we don't want to incur the effort to do so. And I have a feeling this has a lot to do with lock-in. And there are a couple of implications. One, we've already said that your transit and cognitive costs contribute to lock-in, because you have to re-incur those to get back down that learning curve to use something new that does the same thing. People with lower transit costs and cognitive costs find switching more attractive. Why is that? Because if your decay function is less, right, or you can learn more rapidly, then you'll be on a curve that's somewhere in between here. And so each of these differences becomes smaller. Now, if prior familiarity with a technology then has generalizable skills that are transferable, it makes the learning easier. And then it means that, of course, geeks find it less costly to switch. And that sort of comports with what most of us see. People that are trying things most eagerly are the people that already do a lot of stuff online, right? And it's probably the inertia of all the rest of us who are not so totally enamored of the technology that we, by accident almost, unconsciously acquire this facility, that become the inertia behind the services that are hard to get out from underneath online. And I said I would mention briefly network effects, or at least direct network effects. And there's, the literature talks a lot about network effects. It says the more people use the same service, then if it becomes more valuable to every one of the users themselves become an input and make it more valuable. The more of them you have, the more everybody likes it. That can become a source of lock-in as well. If it's a direct network effect, like a telephone network, I can talk to you and everybody on there. It's a direct communication effect. It's not so obvious that works with Google. On the other hand, you can have indirect network effects. With Google is what we call a two-sided platform. And two-sided platforms they're services that sort of bring together or serve multiple parts of different markets at the same time. Newspapers are a common example. If newspaper both have to sell a paper and acquire subscribers, the subscribers are sold then to the advertisers. Work that was actually done by one of my dissertation committee members in 1970, which is somehow forgotten in the modern literature on multi-sided markets, showed that there are really strong positive feedback effects. The newspaper readers actually like papers with more ads because they're search aids, and obviously advertisers like papers with more subscribers. And so if you start out with an advantage in subscribers, then you get more advertisers, and more advertisers gives you more subscribers, and it feeds on itself. Credit card companies, the rediscovery of two-sided markets was people saying, well, credit cards companies really, they serve both customers that want to be able to shop, and you have the convenience of borrowing money temporarily to go into a store, and the stores that want to be able to take advantage of the same lending services to sell to their customers. So you're serving both of them simultaneously. Singles bars, that you don't have a singles bar with only one sex in it, right? One gender, and it's not unusual that you will have like ladies' nights when ladies get their drinks at a steep discount, maybe below cost. Why? Because more women attract more men attract more women, and it feeds on itself. That's positive feedback. With television ads, it's pretty well understood that people don't like commercials, and it works the other way around, which limits, so it's a negative feedback effect, and it limits the amount that people will actually flood or the amount of time that people will devote, or that networks will devote to commercials, although it doesn't seem like, with almost 1/3 of program time now, that doesn't seem like to be a terribly strong constraint. Social networking services are obviously two-sided markets. There's the people on there, there's stuff they supply, there's content suppliers, and there are advertisers. There's really more than just two sides, there's three sides or more. And then search engines, and which is what we're going to turn to, are clearly two-sided markets. And as I pointed out with newspapers, when you have positive feedback effects, and somebody who starts out with an advantage have that advantage amplified, and it makes people who started out later at a disadvantage and hard to attract customers, hard to attract advertisers or whatever. And there are mathematical models that show, yes, it leads to concentration, something that Jim Ross also said many years ago. And this is just, oops, wrong way, an illustration of the way that works for a newspaper. Assume the newspaper puts out the paper, and start with, where am I at here? Number of subscribers, S1. Advertisers say with that many subscribers, this many advertisers want to buy, but with that many advertisements, you get more subscribers, and so it goes, and it spirals up. Anybody new is starting at the bottom with no advertisers, and with few advertisers, it's hard to attract subscribers. And we've seen that over the years, there's been this movement towards one newspaper towns. In fact, it's almost entirely complete. And this is offered as part of that explanation. Oops. Search engines, that clearly one side of the search engine market is the people that conduct searches. And you can think of the native search listings, which is everything in here, as being content, although it's volunteered by people that want to be on there, right? And here are paid ads, most valuable here and then along the side. And so that's the other side of the market. And a question which was hypothesized a number of years ago, 2008, was that maybe feedback effects in search markets, positive feedback effects, contribute to dominance. But nobody's ever really explored that empirically. Fortunately, Carol Ting, when she left here, she went to Ohio University and had the idea of how we could actually collect data that would allow us to do that. And then, because Wayne was really the econometrician, she partnered with Wayne, and then they came to me with some work on sort of the theorizing of it, and we ended up with a paper that I think is pretty neat. So it's 2007 data from Yahoo, and her insight was if we need cross-sectional results, it's kind of hard to go country by country because countries' individual markets differ so much. But in the US, we can use regional markets because all local search services really are serving local types of businesses, and so we can then look at that cross-sectional variation. The data we needed isn't available for all 210 Nielsen markets, but for the 79 largest it was, so that's the sample, or where the sample came from. And then Yahoo and the other search engines will actually, based on their histories, they'll say if you offer the following amount for the following keyword, you would expect that you'd be ranked at such a, first, second, third, or whatever, and you would get the following number of clicks. That's based on their history, so we could use that as the evidence for the customer side, the usage is tracked by clicks, and we track the clicks on the top search ad. Used restaurants, real estate, auto dealers, and personal injury lawyers. It was nice to see that when we looked at the number of ads in the regression, that personal injury lawyers are way at the bottom in terms of the number of people doing this, and that the restaurants are at the top and the others are in the middle. So most of you aren't econometricians. I'm not really either, but Wayne is, and I understand this. Rick knows this stuff very well, but we used, we have a model. You need to include a model for both sides of the market, right? One for the users and one for the advertisers. We use the log of the number of clicks that an ad receives as our measure of consumer usage. And we have the number of ads. You can just count the number of ads that are there on the page. And because it's two-sided, each feeds back to the other, you end up then with log of ads influencing log of clicks, but it's also your dependent variable here. And log of clicks is on the right-hand side, is something that influences log of ads. And so you end up with a simultaneous relationship as indicated by the circles here. And so we use three-stage least squares to address this. And I won't get into the identification issues. I want to pass over this because I know this will be posted later, so anybody wants to look at it, they can see where we got the data sources. It's all there. Instead, what we have in identifying the markets is we have the measures of both the number of ads and the number of clicks, and then we look at things like the income and the average disposable income in a market, which was our HHEBI. Newspaper penetration as a source of advertising competition in the market, and then we looked at radio and number of radio and TV stations as another source of competition. Although they serve different functions in the market. All right, now, so what do we get? And what matters is really these top two lines. I've bolded those. That if we look at the effect of, as a dependent variable, the logarithm of the number of ads on the log of clicks, we get a large positive effect. All right, so it indicates that more people are actually attracted by the paid ads. The more paid ads they have, the more they want to use the service. And on the other side, and it shouldn't be a surprise, that you get more ads if you have more people that are actually clicking on the ad. Right. Now, so we've got positive feedback. And how important is that? Well, you can convert the coefficients from the log to more natural measures, and you can sort of go through a Gedanken experiment and say, suppose that a search engine improved the quality of its search or promoted it better through other media, and in doing so increased the number of people clicking on its ad by 10%. How would that then ramify in terms of, in the long run, because you're getting the feedback, the total number of clicks that you end up with and the total number increase in paid ads. And it turns out it's about a multiple of 25, which just seems astounding. So you end up in the end with a 250% increase in total clicks and 126.3% increase in paid ads. So the feedback effects are quite large, and that alone, if the magnitudes, I mean, even if you're at a small fraction of these magnitudes, could probably explain a lot of what we see in terms of search dominance. We know that Microsoft invested tremendously in Bing, trying to make it a better competitor to Google. They promoted it as saying, we get you there faster and so on. It barely moved their share. Right? It's hard to overcome the advantages that are built in through the feedback effects, having all the advertisers and all the viewers, or not the viewers, the users to begin with. Right? So that's the second of the two studies I was going to report on. Now, we're not quite through with the first one with Adam, but this is sort of the work I've been doing that helps explain search dominance. If you've got dominance, then it's one thing to say, should we break them up? Like in the 60s, people were saying we should break up General Motors. I'm not sure how you break up a search engine. right? Unless you start separating off some of the other services that are attached to it, but you're still left with the search function. The issue that was addressed by the European Commission and what was investigated by the FTC, their staff had actually recommended that the FTC file a suit against Google. The commissioners then decided not to. You can criticize that decision or not, but I'm not privy to everything that was done there, and you have to sort of calculate the likelihood you actually succeed. So what Adam and I have been looking at is the strategy of packaging your own services, in this case it's the apps box, that makes it easy for people to find them and then come back. And of course the apps box has a link back to Google, back to the apps box, and so on. And if you're using frequently used services and they're all packaged together, there's a tendency for everybody to stay sort of in the same neighborhood and be part of the Google universe, or I've called it sort of the corralled services. And this depends critically on the fact that, I don't know about you, my guess is most of you are like me, that when you launch your browser, it opens up to Google. Because the activity I engage in most is search. Now, there are other people who spend a lot more time on Facebook than they do with search engines, and some people have set Facebook as their launch page. But if you have a service or an app that is so popular that large fractions of the user population is actually using that as a launch page, and that launch page can be used as a gateway to other services. And by channeling the directions people go from that launch page, you can favor your other services. And that's what Adam and I have been looking at. This is, when I pull up Google using Chrome, this is what I get in the apps box, two places really. And then you click on the apps box and you get the apps, and you can go, they have more, so you can go to lower layers, but the ones that are on top are either ones that Google is trying to promote, hoping they'll become popular, or ones that are already popular. And I selected the Maps, and go to Maps, and there's the apps box again, which takes you back to Google, which takes you back to other things. And if the other services are the ones that are frequently used, then you'd very seldom stray out of that self-defined universe. And this can be described algebraically fairly easily, but it's quite obvious that if you're strategically trying to figure out what kind of apps to put in the apps box, it should be apps that people use a lot. Right? That if you're trying to conserve on your transit costs, then you want to go to the apps box for things that you use frequently. And then it takes you other things you use frequently, so you should populate that apps box with frequently used services. And that's pretty much what Google has done. Google Plus or Google Circles didn't work out so well. And I think part of the reason there is that we're only talking about transit costs here. There are also the inertia associated with usage. And then for Facebook, Facebook has this huge direct network externality. People are there because other people they know are there, who are there because they are there, and so on. And it'd be very hard to overcome that. You can't overcome everything, but it becomes a way then of sort of building, adding to your walled garden, to use a long time ago phrase that was originally applied to AOL. It's also a way then of favoring your own services against others, trying to get them to launch quickly. So how do we respond in terms of policy? Well, I'll talk briefly about the biased search listings, and there are another number of possibilities. But a lot of them are just not that attractive. So you have regulatory approval every time that Google modifies a search algorithm. They claim it has over 200 different components, and that they're constantly monitoring the response to various things and adjusting it on the fly, which means if you're getting approval every time you do something, one, your strategy is revealed to people that you may not want to know about it. Second is that you're slowed down relative to your competitors, and perhaps if you actually are doing good things for your customers, those benefits for them are delayed as well. One possibility, which I haven't seen, but I think could be done, would be to mandate, if you can demonstrate that there has been persistent and clear favoritism of owned services over competitors out there, and this isn't justified by internal efficiencies of creating an efficient system, ecosystem that works within itself, efficiencies that customers benefit from. You could say you have to split it off. It's a mandated divestiture of a sort. That's a possibility, or you could substitute instead massive fines. But Google's profits are so large that even fines in the $5 billion range or whatever that sound outrageous are not that big to Google. Right? So I would think that divestiture might be an actual strategy, with the intent here being to create a disincentive. If you know that when you're caught, you can lose a prized business you've built, then maybe you'll do something different. Now, it's not obvious. You have to look at the incentives. Does Google really have an incentive to favor? Because if the bias of the search results actually works to the detriment of the customers, and what 95% or more of their total profits come from the search, do they have too much to lose by doing the biasing? That's a good question, and one the authorities will have to look at. Is there really an incentive? Looking at channeling traffic to the apps box. One possibility would be to treat that box as an essential facility, that a competitor could demand equal access to the box as Google's own services. The problem is there's a limited amount of space, at least in that first part that shows up. And if you put two of them in there, then something else that people might like has to get bumped. And you may also, people may like to be able to circle back and around. So you have to look at the consumer efficiencies, synergies that consumers benefit from. Are they important or not? I'm not offering you answers, but these are questions that would have to be addressed. Another possibility would be to let customers customize the apps box themselves. If they don't like Google Maps, they could insert instead Apple Maps, maybe. I still find Apple Maps hard to use. Or MapQuest. Now, I would question, though, whether people would do that, because now you're incurring, again, the cognitive costs of figuring out how to do that, and is it worth it for the little difference you find? So the cognitive barriers may overcome that again. And something I think probably should be done is to think carefully about the merger strategies, the acquisition strategies of search engines or Facebook's. Anybody who has a sufficiently popular service that they become the default launch page for a large numbers of users, then when I look at some of the social media acquisitions by Facebook, for example, I think part of what they're doing is trying to make sure if something hits and becomes the next dominant social medium, they've got it, right? So if you can see that there's a strong potential for competition, and it's hard to find a justifiable efficiency for doing it, those kinds of mergers should probably be precluded, which is not the way we look at mergers now, because they might be viewed as being in different markets. So I think we need to adjust the way we think about antitrust standards. Now, some people will say, well, this is a dynamic market, and we've been hearing this argument since the Microsoft antitrust case regarding browsers, that because the technology is so dynamic, eventually, and maybe before too long, the current entrenched monopolies will become the dinosaurs of the past on their way to extinction. And some people are still making that argument with regard to Microsoft, but Microsoft started to decline after the antitrust decree was imposed. Now, it is the case that they were slow to realize what the web was doing to them, but it's not obvious that it still took 25 years for Microsoft to become less dominant. That's a long time. And I'm reluctant to say because things are dynamic, we're going to cross our fingers and hope things work out well. We need to develop better ways of dealing with this. And the last suggestion is one I just made, is just preclude the acquisition. If you're already a dominant launch page, then preclude things that by a reasonable assessment have a good possibility of becoming similar to that and becoming a new launch page. That it's the launch pages and the the family of services that are built around them that keep people enclosed that become really the sort of the economic units of analysis. We should start thinking in those terms. So that's my research, my thinking, and to everybody here, your friends and colleagues, people I've known for so long, thanks again. Bob.
Okay, so I like your theory of habits except for one little thing, and that is its reliance on economic thinking.
Well, I could have predicted that.
By that I mean the apparent belief that people are making rational decisions, balancing costs and benefits, and I think that describes an early phase of habit acquisition. But I think what you'll find, and if Wildman and Kahneman would read the neuroscience literature on this, you might find that there's an inflection point that repetition leads to habit strength over certain range of repetitions. The number is an interesting question. But then after that, it levels off. That is, further repetition has no further impact on habit strength. It's an asymptotic relationship. And the reason for that is that the activation of the behavior goes totally outside the realm of active rational thinking, be it economic or any other logic that you're using, and becomes dominated by the inner brain, the basal ganglia and the infralimbic cortex to be specific. And at that point, the behaviors are activated simply by the cues, no thinking necessary. So what's missing from the definition that you cited from Kahneman is this notion of automaticity. So anyway, I would recommend that you look into that and build it. So there's I don't know if you call it a negative feedback, but a point at which the increase in habit strength with repetition just ends.
Actually, I mean, that's a good point about responding to cue. But in terms of habit strength leveling off, that was reflected in sort of the minimum cost minimization. You get to the point where you can't do it any better. And that's where habit strength no longer improves.
But the thing is, though, it doesn't matter. You simply replace it. You simply do it, whether it doesn't have whether it has a benefit for you or not. And a couple of things, a couple of challenging examples that have come up in the psychology of habit literature. One is behaviors that are repeated even though each time they require great effortful thinking, no matter how many times you do them. And the other one is singing Christmas carols, which we do very infrequently, and yet, boom, as soon as we see that first Santa Claus suit, we start whistling them to ourselves, which, again, doesn't...
Yeah, that's a good point. I will say one thing in terms of the rational actor model, that most economists actually don't view them as literal descriptions of what's going on, but as... I mean, and rational actor models are used for things like foraging birds and so forth, and they're pretty predictive. That selection over time of those things that work better, whether it's an conscious or unconscious process, results in behaviors and strategies that approximate the rational actor outcome, and that's what was being assumed here. Bill?
Steve, very simple question, but I think most of us think about, well, is there going to be a better search engine, and if there's a better one, I will move. But like pre-Google, I used 2 or 3 other search engines, and then Google was just better. And I've tried Bing, I've tried other search engines, and gee, Google is still better. And so is that part of your formula, or is that actually a completely different model of...
Yeah, I mean, I've heard other people say that they find Bing does about the same thing. But I mean, so is Bing better because you actually find the search results are better, or is it better because you find Google easier to use because you've had so much practice with it? It's kind of hard to disentangle those. I mean, the model is assuming it's the latter. I don't think we have much trouble going with the former. And in terms of, I mean, as long as you have a switching cost, or just look at the notion of network effects, right? So that if you're introducing something that is new and has no network of users built around it, then even if it's better without the network that is part of the inputs that make it valuable, then you've got to overcome that gap as well. And so when I teach this stuff in my classes, I point to the example of Apple And the IBM PC wasn't much of an advance over the Apple II. On the other hand, within 18 months after introduction, IBM had 65% of the market. And they had actually network effects built in. I won't go into that, but so what could Apple do? They can't overcome that because all the developers now are producing the software for the PC, and Apple, if it gets it, it's getting it much later. They have to come out with something that is not just a small improvement, they have to come out with something that's a massive improvement. And so they use the Xerox PARC technology with the graphical user interface and the link to desktop publishing and so forth. And that was sort of gave them enough of a gap that people would adopt it even without a network built around it. I think it's the same thing here. Josh?
So following up on Bill's point, one of the thing is the switching costs wind up being part of the user experience. So it's not like, so sure, Google is, I find it to be a great search engine, but more to the point, the constellation of stuff all right there, I don't want to have diversity. I want to be able to do what I want to do fast. And so, I mean, I guess it's a regulatory problem. How do you do that without actually detracting from the user experience? Because in the end, what I care about is being able to do things as efficiently as possible. And I would actually take a slight reduction in the quality of one of these apps as long as I can maintain my ecosystem.
Yeah, and you're absolutely right. This is a serious policy analysis dilemma. How do you balance off the fact that it becomes this becomes a reinforcement of the original market power that was there, and it keeps building on itself and so this leads to, for markets where they actually sell the services, there will be pricing effects, of course. But on the other hand, you are getting services that you may value more. And how do you disentangle those? Are there some that don't fit that category? Are there some that they're offering because they think it may become the next launch page? I mean, those are issues that can be addressed, but you're absolutely right. This is a serious policy challenge. And it's not going to be just economists that have the tools to address it. Steve?
Could we hold more than one habit? For example, sometimes when I'm working, I want to be efficient, so I go to Google. When I'm at home and I want to look at stuff, I use Yahoo because Yahoo knows I like baseball and basketball, and it throws all this stuff up there for me to sort of look at if I want to, because I'm doing it. So I've got two habits depending on the situation. And so the efficiency may not be the only thing that search engines can do if there are people who want other things added to them, perhaps. But that's a market issue. That's not a regular.
Yeah, but that is just become custom. I have a brother-in-law that's always been with Yahoo, and he stayed with Yahoo because it's familiar, and he's never seen a need to get outside of that. And if you actually look at Yahoo and you look at Bing, they've built their own constellation of services around that too. Not as extensive as Google's, but it's the same strategy. And so I can see that. You've always had something of a schizophrenic personality. This is just further evidence. Yeah. And Chip?
One of the things you didn't talk about was, in some ways it's not just the user, seeking or pursuing their habits, but it's also the software providers who kind of predetermine what the default search engine will be. And so users don't even realize they have a choice of switching in a sense. So, for example, when Apple agreed to use Google as the default browser in the default search engine in their browser, most users didn't realize that they could change that. Mm-hmm. And so, you just typed search terms in the address bar and it went off and searched, but it used Google. And that's playing out again now on smartphones where, and we have to be ready because most of this that we're accustomed to on desktops and laptops is moving to smartphones. And there, again, it's the device manufacturers who are determining which search engines get used on their the browsers on their smartphones. And so that's another part of it
that's true. Yeah, I think you're right. So if you don't have Google preloaded on your iPhone, of course, as somebody who's used to Google, then I went and I downloaded it from the App Store. But you're right. Otherwise, you're going to automatically be going with whatever is, automatically comes up with Safari. And as I was saying earlier with regard to Facebook, that if you've got a strongly embedded set of habits and it's hard to get out of that because you have to learn how to use that other browser as well, then it may be worth that effort. So far, that hasn't seemed to work to get people to move. But I think apps, the apps economy is totally different from sort of web services and navigating the web. And that, I'm not sure how you build a family because I don't see that emerging in the same way. Whether that will just mean Google's monopoly is now this small fraction of a larger universe that has apps as well as the web services. I don't know.
Well, maybe if I could ask one more question just to follow up on Josh's. Will the same analysis apply to these ecosystems? So we've got two ecosystems, an Android and an Apple platforms that everybody's designing for. So to switch from one to the other will be, can your model be applied, will travel kind of thing?
Yeah, one thing that has changed since sort of the PC days, and if those of you who've been Apple users, Macintosh users from the beginning, know that for a long time that Apple would bundle, you'd always get a converter so you could convert PC files to Mac files. The PC side never did that, no incentive, obviously. That need went away when we started having platform-independent applications or software, right? And I think almost all apps now are platform-independent, so virtually everything that's on the Apple App Store is available for Google. So it's really just the use of the device itself, I think, that stands as a barrier rather than, I should say, as a barrier, because you have the preloaded stuff that Chip was talking about. But in terms of getting access, that access issue isn't what it was in the PC days.
Well, we're running out of time, and I'd like to ask the Dean if he'd make a few comments, but let's thank